This is a very clear reason to be aware of smoke detectors when using haze or fog machines. Our second lesson for the day is how I shot and lit this vintage feeling scene and adjusting lighting and framing for multiple different shots. So get cozy because I'm actually really excited for this one. So these few shots that we're going to be going over are actually a few shots out of a bigger project that Sarah and I are putting together. So if you want to see that in the near future, leave a comment down below, and while you're at it, please support the channel and hit that like and subscribe button. But yes, we are looking at 3 different shots here, how I looked them, how I framed them, and some of the prep that went into this entire scene. So let's go ahead and start off with probably the most simple, which is the one of Sarah dialing in this radio here, which I think this radio is really awesome if you ask me. Let's talk about the scene and the props and the setup for a second before we get into the lighting. For this particular project, Sarah and I really wanted to go for this vintage 80s feeling emptied out home. So this location that we got was absolutely perfect for it. It screamed 80s. It had the wallpaper, the wood trim, the pink carpets, everything was perfect how we wanted it. And then we wanted to make sure that everything was cleared out of any furniture and unnecessary junk, if you will. So we made sure it was completely empty, give or take a few straggling props here and there, which we will get to. And then to really add, we always associate haze and grittiness to this vintage feeling. So I wanted to make sure to bring the fog machine. And on top of my Sigma 18-35, I had a black Pro Mist 1.8 Tiffin filter. So that's what we were working with as far as the location and some of the camera specs. And one thing that I'm gonna mention up front as we're getting into the lighting that's most important and going to stay consistent throughout the entire scene is that I'm exposing once again for what I cannot control, which is the outdoor lighting. So I expose my camera for the windows first, and then we're bringing in additional lighting. And you can see here this first shot of Sarah, if we just expose for the windows, well, everything else is going to be dark, which is why we bring in lighting, which is why we bring in these tutorials, and everything gets super fun. So there wasn't too much that we added other than just the house itself as far as the set design goes. I kept that old vintage phone there just to pan up from, just to set the scene a little bit on Sarah, since it's one of the first shots that you're going to see. And other than that, it's a pretty simple shot, and the lighting I wanted to motivate by our outdoor daylight. So I framed my camera to shoot upstage, kind of into the windows, being backlit, motivating my first light, which is the Aperture Nova panel that I use behind a layer of diffusion. And I had that light placed upstage, just wrapping a little bit around Sarah's face. And I placed that diffusion as close as I could get to the frame line because that's gonna give us our largest, softest source. And I put that light upstage and just giving us a nice soft wrap into that Rembrandt triangle that you see on Sarah's shadow side. And then just to add to that contrast, add to that roll off on the shadow side, I just hung up a black sheet from the ceiling, gaff taped it up there just to add in some negative fill, making that roll off really nice and contrasty around her face. So that's a super simple shot. But as we get into the opposite, the inverse shot of Sarah's hand on the tuner, things get a little bit tricky, so buckle up. Now in the background of the living room, I put up some shears as I typically do, and on top of that, I threw a lamp down on a table right by the window, which we're gonna get to shortly. Now the tricky part about this shot was that the entire kitchen behind us was just filled with a row of windows. So we had a lot of unwanted spill and fill light going on that we really couldn't control. So I thought I got lucky with the fact that there were blinds that I could have just closed down. So I closed those, I was like, perfect, it's dark. Looked at the camera and there was a very green tint to the lighting in our whole scene because the blinds were green. So I knew I had to do something to fix that because I didn't want just a green cast through my entire frame. But luckily it was a quick fix. I just took that big black sheet that I had, gaff taped it behind the entire camera, behind the entire really scene. So no light was going to be cast in and there were going to be no unwanted reflections or shadows or color casts. And then as far as the light go, again, we're keeping consistent with the first shot on Sarah, but I'm gonna move that light a little bit more. Instead of casting on Sarah, we've got the light now casting on the radio itself, giving us a nice roll off, and then the black sheet wrapped around to act as some negative fill behind us. So it's still super simple as far as lighting, the subject being the radio, but I did a couple of extra things. Now going back to that lamp I mentioned just a minute ago, I took an Aperture B7C bulb and I stuck it in that lamp set to 2700 Kelvin, just a tungsten color pop, just to add some visual interest there in the background. And on top of that, I also took an Aperture 300D Mark II, brought that outdoors, put a Fresnel 2X on it, and I shined it straight through the shears through the window, a little bit on that back wall, just to add a little bit of interest or texture or contrast of lighting on the back wall. Now, like I said before, both of these were just kind of in case my frame line got low enough when I was shooting as I was moving around, since I'm shooting handheld, just to add a little bit more interest in the back, because remember, we are lighting spaces, not faces, or hands and radios in this case. But if you're sticking with very minimal lighting, say just one light here, you can frame a little bit tighter so you don't have the background in there, and then work with your light source in your negative fill to get this nice contrast ratio. Now, 2 shots down, 2 really nice tight shots, but we've got one more to cover, and that's an establishing wide, where things get really, really tricky. We can't hide lights as easy, hide stands, hide diffusion, and on top of that, we've got Sarah coming from the radio into the living room and then leaving the frame, so we've got a lot of dynamic movement from her and the camera as well, so even less places to hide lighting. So stepping back to the set design for a minute, remember, we want to make sure that everything is cleared out, there's nothing in the background, and it looks neat and tidy how we want it. But on top of that, I really wanted to go with this hard light punching through the haze, feeling this gritty 80s, 70s vintage feeling. So to get that, instead of having shears over that window, I actually took advantage of the blinds that were already existing. And I used the blinds because, one, if it was a bare open window, it would be way too bright. You could see everything, you could see the light source outside. So I brought those blinds down and then just punched the light through the window instead of the shears. So we're sticking with blinds here. And then as far as the lighting goes, I really didn't want to overcomplicate it and make it difficult. One, because we were running out of daylight and that would make things extra hard. But two, just as I mentioned before, sometimes overcomplicating things makes everything a little bit worse or more difficult. So the first light that I did was actually to light up the kitchen in the back and cut through some of the haze in the kitchen. So I used an Aperture 300X with a reflector dish and just punched that a little bit through the kitchen. And you can see that it makes a little bit of more shadow and contrast on the frame right wall. So that's all I did with that, and I had that set to daylight. And then the other light that I used was an Aperture 300D Mark II with that same Fresnel as I had before. And I placed that outdoors behind those blinds. Now, I didn't just throw the light out there to cast through the haze and not think about direction. I wanted to make sure that as the light was coming in, it was still hitting Sarah as she entered into the living room, approaching those boxes, giving her a little bit of that Rembrandt triangle, even though we're working with a hard light source. So I still wanted a little bit of upstage lighting, and also as she walked through that light source, it cast a lot of nice shadows on the trim, on the countertop, on the wall, so it adds a little bit more dynamic interest. And on top of that, I still wanted the light to be pointed at my lens as my camera turned toward the boxes to give me a nice little lens flare and some extra, pizzazz. Now, if I were to change something, I would maybe take some neg and put it behind me just so any hard light coming off of the wall isn't returning back onto Sarah. I didn't do that because, again, we were on very short time. I kind of wish that I did to get a little bit more contrast, but that's just really pixel peeping into some micro adjustments that I would want. So 3 different shots we covered, 3 different lighting setups. I hope that they were all helpful for you. Again, this is part of a larger project, so if you want to see the whole thing, leave a comment down below. I might break down other shots from it because this is really just the tip of the iceberg. I love all of them. First time I've ever been excited about every single thing, happy once I look back on the footage, and that never happens for me. So kudos to myself for that. But that's all that I have for you guys today. If you find this video or any of the other videos on this channel helpful, please leave a like, a comment, subscribe, whatever it is down below, and it will just make me very happy and warm and fuzzy inside. So with that being said, I will dismiss this class. I gotta think of more creative ways to say that because it gets repetitive. But yeah, I hope you guys have a good week and go shoot some fun stuff. Shoot some vintage stuff this week if you can. If you're bored and what should I shoot? Shoot some vintage stuff. Tag Brady's classroom because I want to see it. But that's all that I've got. So cheers. Have a good week. Class dismissed.